And now let's say you agree that, well, the revisionists don't have a particularly good vision of marriage. You agree with that part. You've given us a more philosophically sound account of marriage. It's a comprehensive union of sexually complementary spouses that's ordered towards the bearing and then rearing of children within the context of monogamy, exclusivity, and pregnancy. The next logical question to ask is, well, why does it matter? Maybe you're right that this is what marriage is in some philosophical, metaphysical sense. Why does the state care about this definition? Why should Ohio continue to define marriage in this way? Let me answer that by pointing out that the state's in the marriage business to try to get a man and a woman to commit to each other permanently and exclusively so that any children that that relationship has will have a mother and a father. That from the state's perspective, marriage is based on an anthropological truth that men and women are distinct and complementary. It's based on a biological fact that reproduction requires both a man and a woman, and it's based on the social reality that children deserve both a mom and a dad. Those are three secular truths that I just pointed to, and that explains the secular function of marriage in law. Whenever a baby is born, a mother is always close by. She's normally in the same room. That's a fact of biology. The question for law and the question for culture is, will a father be close by? And if so, for how long? Marriage is the institution that societies all across the globe, all throughout human history, devised to maximize the likelihood that that man commits to that woman, and then the two of them committed to each other commit to that child. And the reason why this matters is that when it doesn't happen, or when it falls apart prematurely, the social consequences run high. And to explain why the social consequences run high, we have to understand that there's no such thing as parenting. There's mothering and there's fathering. Men and women bring different gifts to the parenting enterprise. David Popenoe, a sociologist at Rutgers University, did a study of what social scientists know about gendered parenting. And he concluded, quote, "The burden of social science evidence supports the idea that gender-differentiated parenting is important for human development and that the contribution of fathers to child rearing is unique and irreplaceable. We should disavow the notion that mommies can make good daddies, just as we should disavow the popular notion that daddies can make good mommies. The two sexes are different to the core, and each is necessary culturally and biologically for the optimal development of a human being," end quote. Let me illustrate what Popenoe was getting at with a thought experiment. If I tell you it's Saturday morning and a 5-year-old boy is in the living room wrestling with one of his parents, and this parent is teaching the 5-year-old boy how to be masculine without being violent, that it's okay to put people in headlocks, it's not okay to bite or to pull hair or to gouge out eyes. Which parent is most likely in the living room? And the nervous laughter gives it away, it's the mom. Of course not. It's most likely going to be the father. Who's wrestling in the living room carpet with a 5-year-old boy? It's normally the dad, not because we've engaged in gender stereotypes in which we tell women they can't wrestle with boys on carpets and that only dads can. This is what comes naturally to fathers. It's what fathers enjoy doing with their 5-year-old sons. It's the same way that fathers enjoy throwing kids up in the air and moms say, "Honey, not so high." It's something that comes naturally to mothers, partly probably because they've carried a child in the womb for 9 months. It sets them up to be more concerned, more compassionate. They're more sensitive to these sorts of things. Now, that's the 5-year-old boy with the father in the living room. We see the 10-year-old boy in the backyard tossing a football or playing catch. We see the 15-year-old boy getting ready for a high school dance with his father. All of those things, the father is helping his boy develop into a man, a law-abiding, productive member of society. So when we take a step back from the anecdotes, we see the social science, boys who grow up without their fathers, more likely to commit crime, less likely to graduate high school, more likely to spend time in jail, less likely to spend time employed. Fathers then do something complementary for their daughters. Fathers tend to be the ones that scare away bad boyfriends. They tend to police who's dating their daughter. Partly this is because fathers, on average and for the most part, tend to be larger than mothers. Partly it's because fathers, on average and for the most part, tend to have deeper voices than mothers. Partly it's because on average and for the most part, fathers used to be young boys themselves, and so they know what the wrong sort of young man might be looking for in their daughter. So they're more sensitive to that aspect. So when we and then I should add before, fathers who are married to their daughter's mother model what a good male-female relationship looks like, give their daughters something to look for in a potential boyfriend, fiance, husband. Take a step back from the anecdote, look at the data. We see that girls who grow up without their fathers more likely to engage in sexual activity earlier in life, more likely to have a pregnancy outside of marriage. But don't just take my words for those social science stats. Let me read you a quote, and then I'll ask you who the speaker was. Quote, "We know the statistics. Children who grow up without a father are 5 times more likely to live in poverty and commit crime, 9 times more likely to drop out of school, and 20 times more likely to end up in prison. They are more likely to have behavioral problems or run away from home or become teenage parents themselves. And the foundations of our community are weaker because of it." End quote. Who was the speaker? President Obama. And now you might ask yourself, why was President Obama speaking out on the importance of fathers? Because he's done this several times during his presidency. He answered the question when he gave a commencement address at the all-male graduating class of Morehouse College. He says, quote, "I have tried to be for Michelle and my girls what my father was not for my mother and me. I want to break that cycle." Now, I point to President Obama to say that this should send a signal that it's not as if you grow up outside of an intact married mother-father household that you're somehow destined to fail in life. President Obama is doing pretty well for himself. But even President Obama would be one of the first to say that he had a tougher road in life because his father wasn't involved. That's why he wants to break that cycle. That's why he wants to be for Michelle and his girls what his father wasn't for his mother and for him. So with social science, we never will make it seem like, well, the odds are against you, therefore you're destined to fail. That's not the case. But we also don't want to be kind of blasé about the reality that a child who grows up without a married mom and dad does have a tougher road in life. And this then explains why the state's in the marriage business. It's not because it's a sucker for romance. It's not because the government cares about your love life. It's not because the government cares about the butterflies that you get in your stomach when you fall in love. Valentine's Day doesn't explain why the government's in the marriage business. The state's in the marriage business because the union of a man and a woman can produce a child, and that child deserves a mom and a dad. And when that doesn't happen, either because the union never formed in the first place or because it falls apart prematurely, social costs run high. And we've seen this in terms of, for those children, an increase in child poverty, a decrease in social mobility, an increase in crime, the explosion of our welfare state. Look at welfare spending over the past 50 years. So everything that you could care about, if you care about social justice and you care about limited government, if you care about the poor and you care about freedom, is better served by a healthy, intact marriage culture than by big government programs that try to pick up the pieces, whether it's the form of the police state or the welfare state. A police state being the discipliner, the welfare state being the provider. So, you could say that you're tracking with me up to that. So you see why the Constitution is silent, so the people should get to vote. You see why the revisionist account of marriage fails. You see what the alternative kind of Aristotelian approach that we've taken defines marriage as a comprehensive union of sexually complementary spouses. You can see why the state cares about it because it can produce children. Children need a mom and a dad, and we need an institution that gets men and women to commit to each other permanently and exclusively so that kids have a mom and dad. But your next question is likely to be, but what's the harm if we just redefine marriage to allow Adam and Steve to get married? How does redefining marriage change any of that? All of that would still be true and it would still take place just fine if we also allowed gays and lesbians to participate in marriage. Let me give 3 responses to that and then we'll open it up for questions and answers. All three responses fall under the general rubric of ideas have consequences and bad ideas have bad consequences. That what will be happening if you redefine marriage is that you will replace one vision of what marriage is with a different vision of what marriage is. And the law will teach that one of those visions is true and one of those visions is false, and then people will live out one or the other of those visions. In brief, the law teaches by shaping culture. The law shapes our culture in turn shapes our beliefs shape our actions. And so if the law teaches either the truth about marriage or a lie about marriage, we will see that then embodied in our social practices. That'll be the lived reality. Let me go through three ways in which this will take place. First, if you redefine marriage to say it's a genderless institution, there'll be no public institution left that upholds even the ideal that every child deserves a mother and a father. In fact, to say a child deserves a mother and a father will be relegated as hate speech. Redefining marriage to make it a genderless institution teaches that men and women are interchangeable so that mothers and fathers are replaceable. It sends a signal that marriage is primarily about consenting adult romance rather than both consenting adult romance and an intergenerational relationship. So marriage historically has been about both the love between the spouses, a horizontal relationship, but also the generativity relationship, the vertical relationship, generativity creating and then uniting a next generation with the man and the woman who created that generation. So it shifts one vision of marriage for another. And if you doubt the law has this capacity to teach, consider the experiment of no-fault divorce. No-fault divorce is when we redefine marriage the first time in American life. In the common law tradition, marriage was a permanent relationship, but for a severe reason, you could file for divorce. The common law has a nice little moniker to classify these things. There were the 3 A's at common law: abuse, abandonment, and adultery. Serious reasons for saying a relationship that was supposed to be permanent would have to be declared by the law to be over. My spouse is abusing me, my spouse committed adultery, my spouse has abandoned me. With no-fault divorce, you could now abandon your spouse for any reason at all. In fact, you didn't even have to cite fault. So it could be for no reason, not just for any reason, but for no reason. Some legal scholars refer to no-fault divorce as unilateral no-fault divorce because you don't even need the consent of your spouse. So no fault, no consent, divorce. There's nothing like this in any other aspect of our contract law. You don't get no fault, unilateral no fault, get out of your plumbing contract. You have a greater legal obligation to your plumber or your roofer in most jurisdictions than you do to your spouse. You're going to pay your plumber what you agreed to unless he consents to get out of the contract or he did something with fault. He installed leaky pipes. Otherwise, there's no such thing as unilateral no fault, get out of your plumbing contract. What we saw in the decades after the introduction of no-fault divorce is that divorce rates in the United States more than doubled. Now, part of that was from the culture itself. I mean, the culture shapes our laws just as much as our laws shape our culture. It's a symbiotic relationship, which is why I don't like talk of which one is upstream and downstream. They both impact each other. It's more like a tide. But what we saw was that there was a bad vision of marriage that the 60s gave us. That then led to the introduction of no-fault divorce laws, which then solidified a bad vision of marriage so that now people will get out of their marriages for frivolous reasons. One other historical point I'll mention is that 50 years ago, when Moynihan wrote his famous report on the black family, Moynihan was pointing out that births to single mothers in the United States were approaching 25% for African American children. And he thought this was going to be the greatest social justice issue of our time. That whereas the black family had stayed intact during the evils of slavery and Jim Crow, something was now going on that was dissolving the black family. Conservatives argued that it was the welfare state. He didn't quite make that argument, but he still thought that it was a problem. What's going on? He pointed out that the birth rate to single mothers in the general population was in single digits, but for African Americans it was at 25%. Fast forward 50 years to today. Today, 40% of all children are born to single mothers. 50% of Hispanics, and over 70% of African Americans are born to single moms. These children have done nothing wrong in life, but they will face a much more challenging road in life. So the question becomes, if you think the greatest social justice issue of our time is uniting those 40%, 50%, and 70% of children with their fathers, how do we as a culture insist that fathers are essential when the law has redefined marriage to make fathers optional? That's the first consequence of the legal redefinition of marriage. Second consequence is that there's no logical reason for the redefinition of marriage to stop here. I'd highlighted that partly with the Sixth Circuit opinion, but let me just mention to you 3 words that activists have coined to actually describe where they would like to see marriage go next. The first is the term throuple. A throuple is a 3-person couple. Take the word couple, chop off the C, and then add a THR. My co-authors and I came across this word in New York Magazine. New York Magazine is a publication for elites in New York City. We've subsequently seen it in the Washingtonian magazine, a magazine for elites in Washington. And what it was doing is it was profiling a polyamorous relationship. Polyamory is different than polygamy. With polygamy, it's like a bicycle wheel with a hub and spokes. One man with woman number 1, one man with woman number 2, one man with woman number 3. That's polygamy. Polyamory, it's group marriage. They're all married to each other. So a throuple is a version of a polyamorous relationship. And what New York Magazine was profiling was 3 guys who lived with each other and loved each other. They wanted to have a joint banking account. They wanted to have all 3 names on the mortgage. They wanted to visit each other in the hospital. They slept in the same bed. They cooked meals for each other. They loved each other. And if love equals love, why can't you add one more equal sign and say love equals love equals love? If you go before the US Supreme Court and you say, I am suing for marriage equality for the same-sex couple, on what basis would you deny marriage equality to the same-sex throuple or the opposite-sex quartet? The way that we arrived at monogamy in Western law and culture is that it's one man and one woman who can unite in the act that can create new life, and every new life has one mother and one father. Marriage is about uniting those people in a stable, exclusive, permanent union. But once you say the male-female part of marriage is irrational, arbitrary, bigoted, what is your rational basis for requiring monogamy? What's magical about the number 2 once you say the male-female part is irrational? So that's the challenge of the throuple. The next term we came across was the word monogamish. Monogamish is a play on the word monogamous. This was in the New York Times Sunday magazine, probably the most prominent publication in American public life. If you're a public figure, you want to be profiled in the New York Times Sunday magazine. If you're a writer, you want to write for the New York Times Sunday magazine. This was a profile of the gay rights activist Dan Savage. And at one point during the interview, they said, well, what can straight couples learn from gay couples? And he pointed out they could learn the virtue of the monogamish relationship, which is a union of 2 people, but it's sexually open. The title of the profile was Married, with Infidelities. So they were redefining the vice of infidelity as a virtue of an open relationship. And he was saying, the problem with marriage in the United States is that we have this outdated, inhumane, backwards view that 2 people ought to be sexually exclusive till death do them part. You know, it's fine if people choose that, but it shouldn't be normative. It shouldn't be expected. That provided there's no coercion or deceit, so as long as you're open and honest about it, spouses should be free and in fact encouraged to have open, sexually open relationships. There's no reason to think that one person can satisfy all of your sexual needs for the rest of your life, and many marriages fall apart precisely because they aren't satisfying all of those needs. This is his argument, not mine. So the argument was that marriage, understood as an intense emotional caregiving relationship, could actually be enhanced if you liberated sexual exclusivity from it, if you allowed spouses to seek out sexual fulfillment in other relationships. Last term I'll mention is the term wed lease. Wed lease is a play on the word wedlock. If wedlock denotes something that's strong and sturdy and permanent, wed lease is meant to denote the exact opposite. Just like you can lease a car or lease a house, you should be able to lease a spouse. This was an attorney writing in the Washington Post. The Washington Post is the reasonable liberal newspaper. It's not the New York Times or the LA Times. The Washington Post is the reasonable one. And this lawyer was saying that the problem with marriage law is that it's permanent. But nothing in life is permanent. It's so transitory, so transient. What we need is to have a temporary marriage regime. So you should have the option of signing up for a wed lease rather than wedlock. A 5 or a 10-year marriage contract which can be renewed on good behavior. But if it's not going well after 5 years, it just automatically terminates. And none of his argument was that you wouldn't have any of the turmoil, any of the heartbreak, any of the tragedy of divorce because you only signed up for wed lease in the first place. The reason divorce is so traumatic is that you signed up for an unrealistic type of a union. You had an unrealistic expectation that you and this other person would love each other and care for each other for the rest of your lives. And when, inevitably, you were unable to live up to your unrealistic expectation, that's when your heart breaks, that's when your life falls apart. Much better to have realistic expectations, the argument goes. Sign up for a wed lease. Okay, I said at the beginning I wasn't going to talk about theology. I wasn't even really going to talk about personal morality. So I will leave it to your judgment to evaluate the morality and the theology of thruples and wed leases and monogamish relationships. And I have full confidence that you will do that appropriately. I just want to highlight the public policy consequence. Remember, I was arguing that the reason the state is in the marriage business is to ensure that a man and a woman commit to each other permanently and exclusively so that any children that they help produce will have a mother and a father. But the throuple, the wed lease, the monogamish relationship, they all directly undercut that purpose of marriage. Because what those three redefinitions do is they increase the number of sexual partners that men and women have. The throuple, the monogamish relationship, they increase the number of sexual partners, and then they decrease the amount of commitment. An open relationship, a temporary relationship, not very committed relationship. So increase the number of sexual partners, decrease the amount of commitment. That's a recipe for fragmented families and fatherless children. And yet all three of these redefinitions as a logical matter follow as night follows on day once you get rid of the male-female procreative aspect part of marriage. So that's the second consequence of redefining marriage. Let me move on to the third. This is what I'll close with, and then we'll go to Q&A. This is the consequence that we've been experiencing most acutely, most immediately. This is the consequence for religious liberty. And the basic rubric here is that if you redefine marriage to say it's a genderless institution, and that those who think it's a gendered institution are irrational bigots, the law will treat those people as irrational bigots. And you only have to ask the question of, well, how does the law treat other forms of irrational bigotry to see what will be in store for people who continue to believe that marriage is a male-female union. People who continue to believe the truth will be treated like they're irrational bigots. Let me just highlight some of these. Where to begin, actually, for this? I could do a whole talk on this. I'll start with the Catholic charity adoption agencies. They have been forced to stop providing adoption services to children in the state of Massachusetts, in the state of Illinois, in the city of San Francisco, and in the District of Columbia, where I live. The governments of those various jurisdictions said that it's discriminatory to refuse to place children in same-sex married households. That it's okay to favor marriage over non-marriage, but you have to treat all marriages the same. And so once same-sex marriages, or civil unions in some cases, I think in Illinois, civil unions were there for a year before same-sex marriage. But the basic idea was once you had their legal regime of state recognition for the same-sex relationship, you had to treat it in the same way as you treated marriage. And that if you didn't do this, it was viewed as discrimination, and you can't get an adoption license to run an adoption agency unless you comply with the non-discrimination law. So these are Catholic charity adoption agencies who were taking care of widows and orphans long before the government was taking care of widows and orphans. That's part of medieval history also that I think some politicians forget. So the church was taking care of widows and orphans long before the government was. And the government is now saying, well, you can't do it in accordance with your own beliefs unless you place children with same-sex couples. The church's response was, look, we're not trying to prevent gays and lesbians from adopting from other agencies. They can go to the secular humanist adoption agency. They can go to the Episcopalian adoption agency. They can go to the state-run adoption agency. We're just asking for the freedom to find homes with married moms and dads for the children that have been entrusted to us. And the government said no. This does absolutely nothing to help children. It doesn't make it more likely that more children find homes. All it does is score a point for political correctness, and it uses children as pawns in an adult culture war. In addition to that, we've seen bakers, florists, photographers, a series of professionals whose professional vocations intersect with the wedding industry, be sued and then penalized by the government for declining to help celebrate a same-sex wedding. And what's important to note about these cases is that in none of these situations was the photographer, the baker, or the florist saying, I refuse to serve gay people. That's not what was going on. In many cases, they had been serving gay and lesbian customers with a long track record. One of them were actually sued by a gay couple that they had been providing flowers to for about a decade. They were doing get well soon flowers, happy birthday flowers, things like that. But when they were asked to do the wedding flowers, they had to decline. And then the state attorney general of Oregon sued Barronelle Stutzman, a 70-year-old lady, a grandmother, who had been serving this gay couple for a decade for violating the non-discrimination statute. About a month ago, the judge that is administering this case said that she can be sued in both her professional and her personal capacity. So her home, all of her assets, her retirement account, those are all fair game for what she might be penalized with. Last week, a judge ruled that there's a bakery out of, maybe the bakeries in Oregon and the florists is in Washington State. One's in one, one's in the other. I have trouble keeping them straight. But so there's a bakery in Pacific Northwest, Oregon, Masterpiece Cake Shop. And the judge last week ruled that they can be tried under a more expansive ruling. They can potentially be fined up to $150,000. That's what the potential penalty is here for declining to bake a wedding cake. There's a case of a Catholic couple in upstate New York that own and operate a farm. And it's a type of farm that has like fall festivals and apple picking and pumpkin patches and hay rides, things like that. They also do about a dozen weddings a year in their barn. And the Catholic couple live on the second and the third floor of the barn. They rent out the first floor about 12 times a year for a wedding. They were asked by a lesbian couple, can we get married in your house? And of course they had to say no. They're like, we can't have a gay wedding in our house. That would violate our beliefs about marriage and what we view as our obligations to God to bear witness to the truth. They were sued under the New York State Human Rights Statute. They were found guilty of having violated the human rights of the same-sex couple. They were ordered to pay a $13,000 fine. And they were told that for each additional time they refused to allow a same-sex couple to wed in their barn, they would be liable for lawsuit again. So they have just decided to no longer do weddings at their barn. This is not a live and let live movement. It's not as if conservative Christians have a monopoly on cake baking and floral arranging and photography. In all of these jurisdictions, there were photographers, bakers, florists who, one, were in favor of gay marriage, and two, were in favor of making a profit. So you could have said, just leave this to the private sector, leave this to the market, leave this to liberty, live and let live. If this particular baker doesn't want to make you a cake, go to a different baker. I wouldn't even trust the baker to do a good job. Why would you want to have someone who disagrees with your wedding be the one that helps celebrate the wedding? It only gets worse though, and then I'll stop with these last stories. Three that I want to mention, and I'll go in chronological order. Last spring, the president of Wharton College signed a letter to President Obama that was signed by other university presidents saying, if you issue an executive order banning what you call discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity, for government contract recipients, can you include a religious liberty exemption for a school like Gordon? That's why he was signing the letter. The letter became public, and the accreditation agency for New England schools said, we're now going to have to investigate whether or not Gordon College deserves to be a 4-year accredited university. Because when they saw that the president had signed on this letter, they looked into what Gordon's campus policies were. And Gordon has a code of conduct for students and faculty and staff, saying that they expect chastity of all members of the Gordon community. They understand chastity to be sexual relations are reserved for the marital relationship. Marriage is the union of a man and a woman. The accrediting agency says, well, this seems to be discriminating on the basis of sexual orientation. And so Gordon is now under a 1-year internal review process to determine whether or not it should change its code of conduct. And if not, the threat is you might lose your accreditation. And if you're not an accredited college, your degree won't help you get into law school. You won't be eligible for subsidized student loans. You won't be eligible for the federal grants that fund lots of science laboratories and things like that. The reason the president was asking for the religious liberty exemption in the first place was to make sure that Gordon College wouldn't lose eligibility for government funding for higher education. It's nearly impossible to run a university without ever intersecting with government funds. There are only a handful of schools that do it. Next, in the chronological list, the fire chief of Atlanta was fired from his job for writing a book for his Bible study on human sexuality. He leads a men's Bible study at his church. I think it's a Pentecostalist church. They were approaching the topic of sexuality. He wanted to write a book for the men in his Bible study. 2 sentences in the entire book made reference to homosexuality. And it made the standard traditional Christian teaching on homosexuality. And for that reason, he was fired. A little bit of background about this man. He's a 30-plus year veteran of the Atlanta Fire Department. He had served in the Obama administration as the fire administrator of the United States. One of the federal agencies, I didn't know it existed, there's a fire administration. This guy was the chief firefighter for the nation for the Obama administration. He then went back to Atlanta and he was the fire chief. At some point, someone noticed that he had written this book. There were these 2 sentences that were objectionable, and they filed a complaint. It wasn't a current firefighter, it was a former retired firefighter who just didn't like the fact that this fire chief had these politically incorrect views. The mayor said, when it was brought to him, I'm appalled that someone would say such a thing. This city has no room for discrimination. They did a 1-month investigation. They discovered he had never actually discriminated against anyone, but they said that he violated protocol in self-publishing a book without permission. He says that he had the permission of the ethics office before he published the book. But what's more important is what the New York Times said about this. The New York Times says it doesn't matter that the internal report found that the fire chief had never discriminated against gays or lesbians in the fire department. Merely having the view makes him unacceptable. Which leads us to the third example out of California. 2 weeks ago, the California State Supreme Court amended the ethics code for all state judges to prohibit any state judge from being the leader in the Boy Scouts, from being a leader, a scoutmaster in the Boy Scouts. They amended the requirements. It says that no judge can be part of any group that engages in invidious discrimination, but they used to have an exemption for youth organizations. They removed the youth organization exemption. So it looks like this was very targeted. Removing that exemption, what is the only youth organization that judges would likely be a member of? It's probably the Boy Scouts. How do they argue the Boy Scouts engage in discrimination? While they allow gay scouts, they don't allow gay scout masters. They say they don't want to have openly gay scout masters in the Boy Scouts. That was the compromise that the Boy Scouts reached about a year or 2 ago when they changed their policy. California says to be a scout master would make you a participant in discrimination, and you can't be a judge if you're a member of such a group. Never mind, this probably violates both the California Constitution and the US Constitution, that public servants, public employees retain their rights for free association and free to exercise of religion. That's how the ethics code was changed. The only thing, I do want to add one more thing out of California, because when I got there, I remembered it. I want to contrast Brendan Eich with Phil Robertson. Brendan Eich is the founder and former CEO of Mozilla Firefox. Brendan Eich was forced to resign as the CEO of the company he founded because a blogger discovered that 6 years ago he had made a $1,000 donation to California's Proposition 8. Prop 8 was the ballot initiative that defined marriage as the union of a man and a woman in California. It passed. It got the majority of votes in California in 2008. But in 2014, a blogger discovered that Eich had donated $1,000 in his private capacity, secretly. No one knew about it for 6 years. And they started saying that he could no longer be the CEO of a tech company because he must hate gay people. He was eventually forced to resign, and the chairman of the board said, we were all so surprised to learn that Brendan had made this donation. None of us had ever experienced him saying anything bigoted or homophobic in our life, and we've never had any complaints about him discriminating against gay employees. Well, yeah, that's the entire point, and yet you forced him to resign anyway, because he had donated money to a political campaign in his personal private capacity. Contrast that, though, with Phil Robertson, because I do want to end on a somewhat hopeful note, even though I realize that for the past 20 minutes it's been nothing but depression. Phil Robertson was suspended from Duck Dynasty the week before Christmas because in an interview with GQ, he had paraphrased St. Paul using slightly more colorful language than I think we would have chosen. But within 48 hours, and also Cracker Barrel then removed any of the Duck Dynasty merchandise that included Phil Robertson. Within 48 hours, both A&E, the network that airs Duck Dynasty, and Cracker Barrel had reversed their decision. And the reason why is that the business executives who run A&E and who run Cracker Barrel are out of step with the ordinary Americans who watch a show about duck hunters and who eat country fried steak. So when there was a market mechanism for pushback, the business executives said, we're going to lose. If we suspend Phil Robertson, and if the Robertson family takes their show to a different network, or if our viewers stop watching and therefore our advertisers aren't getting the bang for their buck, we stand to lose. And so they reinstated Phil Robertson in time for the Duck Dynasty marathon that ran all day on Christmas and on Christmas Eve. So what that suggests is that the elites in this country disagree with ordinary Americans. And we see, and actually there was a poll that just came out last week showing that even the majority of Americans who support redefining marriage think that the baker, the florist, and the photographer shouldn't be coerced to violate their beliefs. Ordinary Americans, whether they're for same-sex marriage or against same-sex marriage, think that people should be free of government coercion, harassment, and penalties if they simply believe the traditional definition. But elite America does not. And so what I want to leave with is this challenge. I think that the way that this plays out in the long run is, will elite Americans view people who believe the truth about marriage the way that they view pro-lifers or the way that they view racists? And here's the distinction. When I was at Princeton, most of my classmates, most of my professors said, they disagreed with me about abortion, right? They were pro-choice, but they could at least understand why I was pro-life. And because they could understand why I was pro-life, they were willing to respect the rights of conscience, religious liberty, vis-a-vis abortion. And for most of American history, this has been our solution. After Roe v. Wade became a constitutional right to abortion, but we never said that the pro-life doctor or pro-life nurse had to perform an abortion, or that the pro-life organizations had to pay for abortion. What made the Hobby Lobby situation, the HHS mandate, so unique is that it was the first time in the 40 years after Roe that the government was making pro-life citizens complicit in the evil of abortion. And the reason why that hadn't happened up until the Obama administration is that most people would say, even if I disagree with you about abortion, I can at least understand why you are pro-life, and therefore I won't make you violate your conscience. Contrast that with racists. I have no idea, it's irrational, it's utterly implausible, it's just a result of bigotry, and therefore you don't get rights of conscience or religious liberty. that's the way that you don't ever see religious liberty exemption for racism. So that's going to be the challenge for all of us in the future will we be able to embody and express? So embody by the way we live and the families that we form, and express by the way we talk and the arguments we make, but also how we respect people who disagree with us, that our vision of marriage isn't irrational animus and bigotry. It's actually founded on the common good. It's founded on a reflection on human nature, basic truths about human nature and the common good. And it's reasonable for us to believe this, and the government should respect our freedom to do so.